behalf of the Werkleitz Festival 2021, I'm gladly hosting Mél Hogan for the New World Dis/Order podcast series. My name is Marold Langer-Philippsen.
I think the idea that entrepreneurs are going to be at the center of determining futures is insightful in itself. Like, even if we don't know who those people are, the idea that the entrepreneur is the best sort of suited person to forge a path forward, I think is really interesting. And we've seen the momentum building behind that for a long time. And I think when we imagine who those people might be, whether it's a fiction or the kind of realities we're seeing with Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. So there's two things to the story. You can either abandon Earth and imagine worlds elsewhere, or you can anticipate various kinds of disasters and mitigate some of those repercussions of some of those disasters, depending on how you frame those, what you deem important, and how you anticipate the future. So I think what's interesting in that is the role of speculation. And I think at this meeting, no one can tell the future. No one's particularly well situated to anticipate the future as though it is singular, as though the temporalities are the same for everyone, as though some people haven't been confronted to disaster already and for a long time. This is something I think about a lot in terms of these narratives and these fantasies, that they're in sync with where white people live, especially, without accounting so much for the ways in which there are legacies, ongoing legacies. I'm in Canada, and it's Canada Day, and we've just discovered hundreds into the thousands of unmarked graves of Indigenous children. And so there's a real reckoning with those different sort of histories and the idea of colonialism and what counts as present and future. So I think if you were to ask someone who's related to some of those children, they would have a very different sense of the present and the future. Hundreds of years of policies that put people in a particular temporality in relation to how we imagine disaster and how we imagine, in turn, the escape. So I think that thinking of a bunch of entrepreneurs in a room is perfect in the sense that it feeds really into this idea that we can leave it in the hands of usually wealthy white men to imagine a future that really doesn't account for these different temporalities. So I think what's important in that is it just shows the ways in which some of those politics will be part of the escape. Like when we think of Elon Musk or Bezos, an entire enterprise built on a kind of fantasy. And all you need basically is to have someone like Elon Musk saying that space travel is possible and that he'll make it happen. And so that speculation, that fantasy is almost enough to then accrue a lot of investments to then take these fantasies, these sort of like capitalist exploits beyond Earth. I think Elon Musk in particular and Jeff Bezos, they really embodied the narrow-sightedness and the very problematic idea that it's capitalism that supports those endeavors, that exit. If we imagine the entrepreneur in a room leading the vision for this escape, when these are like billion-dollar investments, why not invest that into a planet we are always going to be tethered to, regardless of space exploration? And also, arguably, everyone's favorite planet is planet Earth. So it's very difficult to understand why you would invest in the exit strategy. And I think there's a lot of anxieties, and I think there's a lot around race and gender that are baked into those things. Almost a toppling of governments being replaced by big tech companies. Like we see this already, and I think the US is this good site for these kind of speculative futures to play out, but we see already Google, Amazon, and in some sense Facebook really investing in healthcare because they have private health. Then you see entrepreneurs in big tech stepping in and saying, actually, if it's going to be privatized, then big tech will take that over. And that's linked actually quite to insurance. Who gets to be insured? Which bodies are deemed to be insurable? What's outside of that? What kind of person you need to be? And I think another topic that I've been researching quite a bit is genomics. If you bring genomics in with big data logics, if you have these incredible pools of data that can essentially create profiles for people, when we think of the future, we can imagine a new kind of eugenics that's pushed through very much new ideas of precision medicine or healthcare. It's very unlikely that we will keep living how we've been living because there will be some kind of modifications needed that will quickly become normalized for humans to endure the conditions of the planet. A lot of feminist scholars have said that we've essentially lost control over the environment. Now we are tinkering with the internal, the genomics, the genes, and all kinds of other sort of AI-assisted or extensions of our bodies. But I don't think it's very likely that we will sustain what we have now. I think it's very likely that there will be that big data, AI, and under the guise of health and precision medicine, we'll see humanity transformed. And it will happen in the same way. Jennifer Doudna is the one who invented CRISPR, which essentially has set this off, made this more possible, this idea that you would cut and paste, as they say, the human genome to edit out sort of errors or mutations that are not favorable for these conditions. This is an argument she makes even in her book, is that it didn't take very long for us to create humans out of the natural sort of environment. We have in vitro fertilization, and that's like choosing the best embryo, and no one's really protesting against that. It just happened slowly. It made sense for humanity. There was also a social justice angle to it where people who couldn't conceive, I hate using the word naturally, but in the more obvious conditions, then could opt. So there's always a sort of social justice argument to be made for these kind of interventions into the human body. And I think that we'll see a lot more of that. It may just creep up on us, right? I imagine it will work both as a kind of, I want to say, assurance, and ties into, I think, what we'll see as a radical transformation of insurance, a much more neoliberal, individualized push for humans to opt into these kind of systems and these kinds of technologies. And of course, we can already imagine the kinds of divides that will create. But I think big tech taking over the ways in which we understand ourselves, the kind of predictive qualities that's built into big data already. A lot of people know that big data and AI is biased to the programmers, and it's incredibly problematic, and this has been pushed back a lot. But I do think that the momentum behind big data and the kind of investments behind them, they have a momentum that's very hard to stop, even if the critique is there. And so I think that in terms of insurance, it reminds me of the word sustainability. It's what are we sustaining? Is it good to think of a moment from which we then sustain, right? Because there's no sort of specific moment in time that we depart, that we say this is the moment, and from here we'll extract and make sure to return to. So I think these ideas of sustainability and also tying into insurance, because we want to know that we will have a life, not just a life, but a life worth living. A recent book by Toby Ord, who wrote The Precipice, he really outlines all the threats to humanity. And what's interesting in that book is that climate change is not in the top, as we might imagine. And as we're certainly feeling out west in Canada right now, it feels like it's just on fire, it's just burning. It just feels like the end. But I think it's interesting to imagine that if climate change is not one of the most pressing threats, what are those threats? And this book was written before the pandemic, and it makes clear that lab leaks, these sort of things that we might engineer ourselves out of humanity and then find solutions. Like the vaccine is fantastic, but there's also a very good chance that it was a lab leak. This is like no longer really completely a conspiracy theory. And I think the lab leak theory has many origins. Some of those are incredibly racist and convenient for pushing really racist agendas. But I do think that the questions of biosecurity, that's where we should be investing. If we want insurance, it's like, let's invest in that. That would be the argument of that Precipice book. And just managing AI so it doesn't get out of control. I would say those are the two biggest threats. So if we want to talk about insurance, I think it's about the threats that we've created against ourselves in some way. I would say that there's almost a way that religion works, belief in big data as if you just have enough data, eventually you can locate patterns and make sense of those patterns, right? You just need more data. And I think that has been the push from the very beginning and why we've seen $1 billion of investment in these kinds of projects, because it's just taken to be true and taken to be a new kind of science, what they call high throughput science, which is essentially this idea that you don't come in with a hypothesis, you let the incredible amount of data generate patterns that you then make sense of. I think the threat is that's incredibly problematic because there's no longer acknowledgement of all science is political, all science starts with a question that is a particular kind of investment in humanity in the future, whatever the science may be. So I think when you have big data, you basically blur or remove the idea that there's any politics to that big data set, to that kind of investigation, to the kind of underpinnings of more data equals more truth. And I think that's one of the major threats. I think the other one is who has access to those investments, to those machines, and who's informing sort of the output of those things. And I think, again, your idea of insurance is like, that will connect back into who has access to certain kind of things, who is deemed a good human or a viable human, what kind of human life is desirable. Those things are really connected. For most people not thinking critically about these questions, it is very compelling. It's very persuasive. There might be really incredible outcomes for humanity out of these things. It doesn't mean that the potential for destruction isn't also embedded in those same technologies. And so I think the threat of AI is really in the sort of understanding of it as neutral, as self-fulfilling, and also then the deployments that we can't even imagine today. A lot of the investments go to the military. That's like the first testing site. That was true for genomics. It's true also for drones or these robot dogs. And usually it's a defensive against some sort of imaginary evil. And again, I'm thinking more in the US, but that tends to influence greatly the thinking in Canada and I think overseas as well. I was rereading yesterday for something unrelated to this, the Eve Sedgwick piece on paranoid readings versus reparative readings. And I think with all this writing, as a scholar and artists also do a lot of these kind of interventions to both expose these threats and to critique them. I think, what does it tell us that we didn't already know about the momentum behind these kind of investments? And that's my new starting point. I have this big urge in my own work, whether it's about data centers, internet infrastructure, genomics, or storing our humanity in a kind of digital afterlife. It's always this kind of expository, exploratory critique, but I think in a sense I'm not learning anything new from this. And I think your question really points to the kind of so what, or what then? What do we do with all of these critiques? I don't want to say that artistic or scholarly interventions do nothing. I think they're extremely important. If they weren't, we wouldn't see universities being defunded in the humanities and social sciences. I think we are also a threat. In the US, there's a big push against teaching critical race theory. It's because it's a threat. Here, especially where I'm located, there's a big push for entrepreneurialism, neoliberalism, turning everything into a kind of a business and making everything very utilitarian. I would say, sure, maybe that's a vision of the university, but it's also a way to dampen the threat of these critiques. So as a scholar, I often ask myself this question. It's like, what are we doing? What can we do to push forward? But I do think that in the end, it's going to have to be mass movement protests on the ground, toppling over things that people stand against. It's a very hard question because obviously if I had any sense of how to counter all these things beyond the kind of writing that I do and the thinking I do and the kind of communities that I form, I would be doing those things and mobilizing the people around them. Personally, I often think we'd be better off abolishing the internet, but I think it's because I'm old enough to remember a time before it, and maybe I'm just nostalgic and deluded, but I do think life was better, and I think the environmental impacts of the internet are completely unsustainable and are driving us very quickly into completely irreversible living conditions. So what's the point? I think it should, like science and technology, I think that sometimes we could have tested something out and we can work our way back. That's not likely to happen. This is my just if I ruled the world, I would just abolish the internet and maybe we could undo some of that damage. But I do think when you talk about labor conditions that you've been fighting for your whole life as an activist and as just like an informed citizen, we are seeing these initiatives, often in technology, they call them like disruptive technologies. We saw Uber, for example, disrupt taxi or transportation. And maybe it was good to rock that boat a little bit. Maybe it forced these other kinds of monopolies to have to rethink how they operated, was it fair? And then the critiques came to say, well, actually, none of these people have any kind of benefits or support. They're completely exploited by this company. And now you're seeing the work conditions for Uber after much sort of pushback, I would say scholarly, but also on the ground activism to say, no, like we're not accepting that a big tech, just because it's a company that we've opted into, determine the ways in which the labor conditions unfold. And I would say with Amazon, while they tried to rig the sort of anti-unionization, I think what we're seeing with Amazon now is that the union is possible and will radically transform the work conditions for those workers. So I think that's happening rather quickly. I don't want to be too optimistic because that's not my style, but I think what we are seeing is really these rapid changes in these kinds of things. That kind of disruption happens many times over for any particular kind of industry. And I think that's something really interesting to track. And I agree 100% with you that without making labor conditions, work conditions, the center of the protest, the pushback, we're left with nothing. And I think tied into that is the push to have big tech and all kinds of industry pay taxes, to have more transparency around the ways in which trickle-down economics doesn't work and how big tech profits of the misery of a lot of people. So I think a simultaneous look at labor conditions and the ways policies are created around these big corporations, I can see the potential for incredible harm, but also that people are not taking it. People are now doing big companies like Amazon and Uber and Google, when they fired people who were really pushing back against the sort of racially coded bias in their algorithms. It makes a lot of noise. Like, the internet's annoying because everyone's having every single one of their thoughts out there all the time, but it also means that companies' feet are held to the fire. They do have to respond to a very visible critique. And I think that's new, and it's faster and it's harder to dismiss. We often think of technology as progress. It's as though progress is informed by technology. And then I think of the internet and internet time, and I think that it sets the conventional time, but that also means it sets a particular kind of pace, a particular kind of rhythm. And I think of how most people are miserable at their jobs because in academia, people just constantly feel like they can't keep up. And so these different sort of paces, temporalities, these different sort of places where we see there's not enough time. And I would say academia is one of the main complaints, is that to do everything, to get tenure or whatever, there's not enough time. And I would say the ways in which Amazon workers are tracked really like minute by minute of their time for efficiency is another way in which time and progress intersect. And then I think of another question, if you go to somewhere like New Orleans, where the sense of time is more about how much time is left, right? Like before the sea takes over or the hurricanes destroy everything. There's a sense of almost like the time that has become global is the time of the internet and the pace of the internet. And that's a really rapid, I would say, unsustainable time that is not very much in sync with embodied time. It's not very much in sync with the ways in which I would say we want to live. And the pandemic maybe has been this really good sort of disruptor of that time. And I think that for a lot of people who were not in the throes of it, the people who were waiting it out, the more privileged people, that sense of time has really been shifted. So I think it's a really interesting provocation, probably not something that we can fully answer for everyone in all places, but I think that the tether of human time and progress in relation to the internet, it's like if you take the internet away now, what's the meaning of time is what your provocation makes me think. I like this idea of dream time. I don't know well enough to speak to it, but it makes me think, is there other ways to think of time in relation to this bigger sort of project of resistance? But I would say that the heat wave, the pandemic, the bodies from the residential schools, they bring time into quite a kind of collision. If I just take where I'm standing from as an example, I think centering time in these critiques, or at least in these ways of thinking what's possible and kind of resistance is possible, is really interesting. The residential schools closed in the late 90s, and I think people really imagine colonialism as a thing of the past. But if you think of these schools running into the 90s, and a lot of people have said, sure, the schools closed in the 90s, but then there's child and welfare services that essentially took over and is continuing to do the same thing. To be surprised by that means to be sheltered from that. And I think there's a lot of shock and horror at the unmarked graves and the kind of technologies that have been quickly deployed to identify these. And I also have the question, why now? How are we coming to terms with this now? I think Canada has to, reckon with its own genocide. And I think we've had this Truth and Reconciliation document proposed for years. It's just been ignored. This kind of evidence brings time into relief, right? I mean that in the Sarah Ahmed way, like the critique, the complaint is supported now by evidence. And it's very difficult to dismiss, I would say in particular, when it comes to the bodies of children. There's a kind of innocence associated with that. And also an intention to destroy, nipping it at the bud, destroy things before they become agents or independent agents in the world. I think to be surprised by that is to be sheltered. And this is what happens in Canada is, I would say very few settler Canadians know their histories. They think if they learn at all about Indigenous history in school, it's a thing of the past. And it's also I would say, very much bright-sided, very much twisted, so that it's a different kind of history that people can celebrate on Canada Day. It's very much about negotiations and treaties, and a lot of it is left out. I very much appreciate the work being done right now to disrupt that narrative that Canada upholds of itself. The truth is, we've had, much like the U.S., we're a nation founded on the railroad, oil pipelines, and those go through Indigenous lands, and they break the treaties in terms of the labor that was used, Chinese labor that then was not benefit at all, didn't reap any of the benefits of that kind of frontierism or expansion. We had Japanese internment camps. We had slavery. Canada has a very, I'm not a historian, but I just think that it's important to think in terms of these kind of temporalities, these kind of possibilities, is to reckon with the fact that it's a moment for white people to confront that colonialism and technological progress has given way to complete climate catastrophe, planetary deterioration. That is a white supremacy project. That is a neoliberal capitalist project. And so I think that all of this put together is evidence of that we need to grapple with. It's interesting that now white people have to reckon with these questions that have been so present and inevitable for so many other people in different locations, whether in terms of race, class, or geography. But I also think it's problematic to be surprised by sort of what we've set in motion, and to be surprised that we have to reckon with it, that we can't escape the conditions that we've created out of this sort of white supremacist neoliberal project. Let's just say settlers have a lot of work, a lot of repair work to do, a lot of reckoning work to do. In some ways, my work on genomics and this idea of the code of life has brought me to the question of death and the code of death. I wrote this recently in a paper, but I remember as a kid thinking about Walt Disney. I don't know if you remember this, but knowing that he had been frozen, cryogenically frozen, because there was this idea that if you were a rich white guy with access to these kind of technologies, you could just pause death. And then when technology caught up to the complexities of biology and the human body, then you could bring that person back. I didn't realize it was just his head that had been preserved, so it's also very interesting to think of the brain. I think a divide that informs the way we see the world, but whether it's reason versus passion, or intellect versus emotion, or even in some sense, technology versus the environment, right? These kind of binaries that have shaped a lot of the ways in which a lot of these entrepreneurs invested suddenly. My theory is that these are men who are aging and becoming aware of their mortality in a way that women or non-binary folks with periods or with cycles in their bodies are constantly reminded that time passes, that these sort of hormonal shifts in the body, not to say that men don't have these, but I think there's a way in which you don't need to confront this every single month as time passing, as having this kind of biological clock. And so my theory is that a lot of these guys come to this realization of aging and death a little bit later in life. They have a lot of money. Apologies about the sirens. So I think what's interesting is who's making these investments. Usually it's, in some sense, Peter Thiel, who's investing in exiting Earth in these projects to go to outer space with Musk, is also investing in curing death, curing aging. These are the same kind of investments. It's reckoning with sort of the end of times, whether that's the planet or the personhood. So I'm very interested in the kind of anxieties that drive these projects, whether it's, and again, Elon Musk is really invested in having this sort of computer brain interface, I think in part to upload that into its own kind of server space data center, so you can access consciousness or someone's, I guess, life experiences in a kind of virtual capacity after they pass. So I think it's no coincidence that a lot of the people investing in exiting Earth are also investing in these kind of future imaginaries where you are stored on a server somewhere. I think both are quite misguided, but I think are fodder for thinking through the kind of anxieties that we're brought to given sort of the planetary conditions, the political conditions. There are probably, I want to say maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of biotech, big pharma companies that are about aging, specifically about countering aging, as though aging is a disease. David Sinclair is one who comes to mind, who works at the Harvard Medical School and is really investing in figuring out what happens at the molecular cellular level in terms of aging and making humans resistant. Like, aging is apparently not a necessary function of the human body, it's just a glitch in the program. To me, that spells disaster. It's just maybe a kind of fiction that hasn't been thought out in terms of housing policy in terms of what do we do with the infinite life. But I do think the project is both sort of a proof of concept that you could maybe locate humanity either in the brain or in genomics, and maybe bringing those two things together, that would complete the project of what is human. I think there's a risk that they open doors into things that are very different from what those things are purporting to do. And I think we're seeing it with Google in particular, developing these really sophisticated conversational models. They're called neural conversational models, but basically there's a very good chance you don't know if you're speaking to another human or if AI is just basically doing a lot of customer service, but a lot of also now increasingly deployed, I don't think quite successfully, but for therapeutic purposes. So if you have PTSD, or if you have some sort of mental health issue that requires a check-in with a counselor, then you're having AI respond to that. So I think it's not just about storing the digital afterlife, as we're seeing in more and more fiction, which usually hints at where technology is going, but I think it's also about using the idea that there could be a kind of human to respond to human needs, whether that's sex robots or virtual therapists or other kind of servants for generally wealthy humans. I think that's a push that we've been seeing a long time. And this project was always meant to be to liberate humans from labor, especially labor that can be difficult on your body or that was just unpleasant, that no one wanted to do. But what it does, in fact, is just it generates more of those kinds of conditions. I always think of the robot that I think it was Amazon uses to help you bend over to pick up heavy packages rather than replacing those horrible jobs. So I think the sort of digital afterlife is a bigger goal, and along the way we're going to see deployments of these kinds of AI human sort of interfaces that are going to become increasingly invisible to us, become proof of concept that there is a kind of consciousness that can be stored outside of ourselves and that can work to serve us. I think, as the book The Precipice warns, those things can so quickly go off the rails. We've seen examples already of drones shooting down things and there were no orders sent to those drones. And this is just the beginning. So I think the digital afterlife is like this end goal that will, along the way through experiments, generate a whole bunch of strange, potentially destructive, potentially also reparative moments, because I think no technology really, and this is why we can keep pushing them forward, does only one thing. This feeling is that we are increasingly moving towards technologies that blur a kind of shared reality with, whether it's very possible now to reanimate old photographs. It's also very possible to create videos. There's a famous Tom Cruise video. It's not Tom Cruise, but you can't tell the difference. I think we're at a risk of a world taken over by disinformation. We might not think of that as a threat. We might think that we have a good grasp on our reality, but we already saw with the storming of the Capitol building in the US, led by something like QAnon, which is an incredible conspiratorial site and movement, but it can't be dismissed. It is massive, and that is driven by disinformation. And the other thing that's interesting that you point out is Facebook, I think, is probably nearing the point of having more accounts by people who are now deceased than alive. So that's an interesting grappling. What happens with these accounts that memorialize or reanimate, because I think a lot of people are shocked sometimes to be sent these kind of memories or reminders that are meant to be playful, I think, from Facebook, but it doesn't know alive from dead in that sense. And so I think it can be very triggering, it can be very destabilizing, if not traumatic, depending on the situation of that death. So I think death is really one of the main themes. It's like a recirculating, and it's a breaking down of time. If we come back to that theme, is, what happens with temporality? Because I think reality is tethered to a kind of illusion of time passing, a kind of chronology, even though we know that there are, I think it's quantum physicists who say time is sort of an illusion, but it's a very compelling illusion and one that keeps us connected to a shared sense of progress and protest. One of the biggest threats, and I think this is in the Precipice book as well, is disinformation. And beyond disinformation, this like reanimating of things that don't exist or never existed. So I think that's another way to think of that kind of digital afterlife concept.
This was Mél Hogan in a podcast by Werkleitz Festival 2021 about big data belief.